Tonight, the Supreme Court alters history. A divided court strikes down a cornerstone of civil rights. Jan Crawford is there. We now know where the man with America's secrets is holed up. Bob Orr is tracking fugitive Edward Snowden. Opponents try to stop a new abortion law in Texas, while supporters say it will improve health care for women. Manuel Bojorquez looks at the controversy. And blindness runs in the Jackson family. So does an incomparable vision. Vanita Nair with a story of triumph over tragedy.
This is the CBS Evening News with Scott Pelley.
Good evening. Today, the Supreme Court essentially knocked down one of the pillars of the civil rights movement. It invalidated a key part of the Voting Rights Act, the law enacted in 1965 to stop racial discrimination at the polls. The Voting Rights Act requires 9 states to get federal approval of changes to their election laws. Other parts of the country covered by the act include most of New York City and several counties in California. But that requirement for federal approval was struck down in a 5-4 decision today, with Chief Justice John Roberts joined by Justices Scalia, Thomas, Kennedy, and Alito in the majority. Liberal Justices Breyer, Ginsburg, Sotomayor, and Kagan dissented. Jan Crawford, our Supreme Court correspondent, has the story.
The decision invalidating a section of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 deeply divided the justices, but it rested on a simple premise. As Chief Justice John Roberts said, nearly 50 years later, things have changed dramatically. At issue was a provision in the act that singled out states with a history of discrimination in voting, mostly in the South, and required them to get pre-clearance, approval from the federal government before changing voting procedures. Officials in Shelby County, Alabama, challenged that provision, arguing the South had made great progress since the act became law, and today should be treated like the rest of the country. In its 5-4 decision, the court said Shelby County had a point, and the justices turned the spotlight squarely on Congress, saying it was wrong to use a decades-old formula to keep the same states under federal oversight. When Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act in 2006, it continued to rely on rates of minority voter registration and turnout from the 1960s and early 1970s, instead of using current data. History did not end in 1965, the court said. In the years since, voting tests were abolished, disparities in voter registration and turnout due to race were erased, and African Americans attained political office in record numbers. But Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, joined by the 3 other liberal justices, said Congress assembled volumes of evidence to show federal oversight in the covered jurisdictions worked, and that without it, the covered states could revert back to their old ways. Throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. But today's ruling means those covered states and local governments are now free from federal oversight. They can immediately change their voting laws and their procedures without having to come here to Washington to get approval first. Unless Congress can rework that formula to set which states are going to be covered. And everyone today, the consensus is Congress is never going to be able to agree on that. So that means that you're still going to be able to sue if these laws intentionally discriminate against minorities, but those pre-clearance requirements, well, they're all but dead.
And the president said today he was very disappointed by the decision. Jan, thanks very much. The Voting Rights Act grew out of a decisive moment in the civil rights movement. The Selma to Montgomery marches of 1965 were protests of the poll taxes and literacy tests that prevented minorities from voting. Marchers led by Martin Luther King Jr. and others were repelled by police, but they persevered. And months later, President Johnson invited King to the Voting Rights Act signing ceremony. Our research department tells us in 1965 there were no African American senators and no African American congressmen from the areas covered by the act, but today there is 1 senator and 17 congressmen. As Chief Justice Roberts said in his opinion, the country has changed, but a question asked by many today is how much? Here's Mark Strassman.
Philadelphia, Mississippi has struggled with infamy since the summer of 1964. 3 civil rights workers registering blacks to vote were murdered by the local Ku Klux Klan.
We're trying to improve our city.
Jim Prince and Leroy Clemens are part of the New South. Prince runs the local newspaper. Clemens heads the county's NAACP. They have formed a multiracial coalition in Philadelphia to help heal the city's wounds.
My predecessors would probably not have sat here and trusted Jim at all.
Once we kind of got to know each other and understand where the other was coming from, we made a lot more progress.
Is there still an issue with trust?
I think it's more about the people who are still in power that want to stay in power. You look at all these new voter suppression things, voter ID laws, and you see it happening all over the country, and it's scary.
African Americans make up 37% of Mississippi voters, the highest percentage in the country. 29% of its state legislature is African American. That's also the highest in the country.
There's been incredible change, basic, drastic change. When is the federal government going to quit punishing us for the sins of our great-great-great-grandfathers?
Jim may think we're there already. I don't think so. To me, there are still people in positions of power and authority in Mississippi and in the South who are not ready to turn over control or share power with the minorities right now.
The weight of history on this community may be lighter, but it has not fully lifted. Mark Strassman, CBS News, Philadelphia, Mississippi.
Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin revealed that Edward Snowden is still at the Moscow airport, but Putin said he will not turn Snowden over to the United States. Snowden is the former National Security Agency contract employee wanted for espionage. He exposed 2 top-secret surveillance programs, one that collects the phone records of millions of Americans and another that monitors internet traffic. Bob Orr has the latest.
In a clear swipe at Washington, President Vladimir Putin said Edward Snowden has committed no crime on Russian soil, so he will not be arrested or expelled. Snowden is a free person, Putin said in a news conference. He added, the sooner he chooses his final destination, the better it is for him and Russia. But there is no outward sign Snowden is preparing to leave Moscow, and his future travel plans are unknown.
I'm no different from anybody else.
While Snowden is carrying some of America's most sensitive intelligence files, Putin said his security services are not working with the former NSA contractor. But U.S. officials are skeptical. Putin also pointed out the U.S. and Russia have no extradition treaty, but the countries have swapped prisoners and suspects before. Again today, the White House asked Snowden be returned to face criminal charges. In a statement, a National Security Council spokeswoman said there is a clear legal basis to turn him over. We are asking the Russian government to take action to expel Mr. Snowden without delay. And Secretary of State John Kerry stressed the U.S. does not want to damage relations with Russia.
I would simply appeal for calm and reasonableness in a moment where we don't need to raise the level of confrontation over something as, frankly, basic and normal as this.
But the fact is, U.S. prosecutors are apparently no closer to getting their man, and there's a growing fear now that they might not ever get him. One law enforcement source told us, Scott, we probably had our best shot in Hong Kong.
Bob, one thing that's not clear, how much information did Snowden get away with?
Well, the government's still working to find that out, Scott, but sources do tell us that the NSA has been able to retrace his actions at the agency, and they believe he accessed a large number of files. Now, the Senate Intelligence Committee Chair Dianne Feinstein said maybe 200 files, but others say it could be even more than that. And officials fear that everything he took has probably been compromised, most likely, they say, taken by Chinese intelligence during that month Snowden spent in Hong Kong.
Bob, thanks very much. The Internal Revenue Service got some more unwanted attention today, not for targeting political groups. This time it was a congressional investigation that revealed a technology contractor won questionable bids worth up to $500 million. Nancy Cordes takes a look.
Braulio Castillo began winning hundreds of millions of dollars worth of contracts with the IRS within months of founding his technology company, Strong Castle, in early 2012.
We have found the kind of wrongdoing that should have caused this contract to be canceled.
Republican Darrell Issa chairs the House Oversight Committee, which investigated Castillo's rapid rise. They found that just before opening Strong Castle, Castillo filed for a disability rating with the Veterans Administration, citing a foot injury he suffered in 1984, 27 years ago, while playing sports at a military prep school. That rating enabled Castillo to register Strong Castle as a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, eligible for preferential treatment in bidding competitions.
Understand, never served a day on active duty, went to a school at taxpayers' expense, and had a minor injury that didn't keep him from going on to play college ball.
Castillo, who lives in Virginia, also chose carefully where to locate Strong Castle. In the heart of Chinatown, Washington, D.C., says his company website, a formerly blighted area now bursting with shops and restaurants. But Chinatown is still designated a government hub zone, which meant Castillo's company qualified for even more priority in bidding. Yet when investigators visited Strong Castle's offices repeatedly, no one was there. Investigators said it appeared Castillo's wife manipulated employee timesheets to make it appear that workers spent more time there. All of which Castillo denies, telling CBS News in a statement, "Throughout our work with the IRS, we have never received any improper preferential treatment and have competed fairly for every contract that we have received."
The committee told the IRS about their findings several months ago, but officials there said it would be too disruptive to cancel a $260 million contract with Castillo. And so, Scott, he and those officials have both been called to testify here on Capitol Hill tomorrow.
Nancy, thank you. President Obama said today he refuses to condemn future generations to a planet that is beyond saving. And with that, he ordered the Environmental Protection Agency to reduce pollution from power plants. More than 40% of America's electricity comes from coal, which is a big producer of greenhouse gases. We saw more encouraging signs about the economy today. Homes are selling at the fastest pace in 5 years. In the 20 biggest cities, home prices jumped more than 12% in April from the year before. And a business group said that consumer confidence is at a 5-year high. Will a filibuster block a controversial abortion law? Jurors at George Zimmerman's murder trial saw pictures of Trayvon Martin's body today. And a boss is being held hostage by his own workers when the CBS Evening News continues.
This portion of the CBS Evening News is sponsored by the Spark Business Card from Capital One. Earn double miles or 2% cash back.
A Texas state senator has begun a 13-hour filibuster to try to run out the clock on a new abortion bill. It would be among the most restrictive laws of its kind. The bill would ban abortion after 20 weeks of pregnancy, require doctors to have admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles, and it would require clinics to upgrade their facilities to the level of surgical centers. Manuel Bojorquez is following this for us.
Democratic State Senator Wendy Davis started talking at 11:18 this morning. She wore tennis shoes for the filibuster because she must stay on her feet until midnight.
The actions intended by our state leaders on this particular bill hurt Texans. There is no doubt about that.
Texas would become the 5th state to require abortions be performed in hospital-style operating rooms. Bill opponents say the expense of upgrades would force nearly all of the state's abortion clinics to close. Amy Hackster Miller is CEO of Whole Women's Health, which manages 5 Texas clinics.
What would you have to do?
Oh, I'd have to knock down the wall between this room and another room. I'd have to add an airflow system. I would have to have oxygen piped in through the walls instead of in the tank that we have in here.
She estimates costs could reach $2 million per clinic.
Your goal here is what?
Is safety in abortions.
Republican Senator Bob Deuel is a doctor and an author of the bill.
All of these things have been proven to improve patient care, and we think that if we acknowledge that abortion is legal, but we also feel that if a woman's going to have an abortion, that they need to do it in the best possible situation.
Having abortions done in an ambulatory surgical center is not going to change the safety. It's not going to make them more safe. I think that our opposition has been very strategic and very effective at using the stigma that surrounds unplanned pregnancy in this country and the stigma that surrounds abortion to cause sort of a sense of alarm.
The Texas Medical Association has also voiced its opposition to the new measure. Scott, even if the filibuster succeeds, Governor Rick Perry can call another special session to try to move the bill through.
More to come on this story. Manuel, thanks very much. At George Zimmerman's trial in Sanford, Florida, a crime scene investigator is taking jurors through the events of the night that Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin. Today, the jurors saw photographs of Martin's body and the handgun used to kill him. Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch volunteer, is accused of murdering Martin, who was unarmed. Zimmerman claims it was self-defense. More than $1 million in cash has vanished from a jetliner. We'll have the story when we come back. The FBI is searching for $1.2 million in cash. It was supposed to be part of a $50 million transfer that was shipped in a specialized container aboard a Swiss Air flight that landed at New York's JFK Airport on Saturday. Police don't know if it was stolen in Switzerland or in the U.S. The president of a Florida-based medical supply company is being held hostage by his own workers in China. Chip Starnes spent his 5th day today inside the plant near Beijing. About 100 workers say that they are owed back wages, and they claim that Starnes plans to move their jobs to India. Starnes calls the dispute a miscommunication. Nelson Mandela, the former president of South Africa, remains in critical condition at a hospital in Pretoria this evening. Today, members of his family gathered in Kunu, his ancestral home. His eldest daughter said they discussed sensitive family matters. Mandela is nearly 95. He's battling a recurring lung infection. A rare disease runs in their family. Can they help produce a cure? That story is next. Finally tonight, a rare and mysterious affliction has hit dozens of members of the same family in eastern Iowa. Some might call it a family curse, but Vanita Nair tells us they prefer to look at their blessings.
67-year-old Jerry Jackson still works 2 jobs every day. He views the world a little differently than most.
Here you go. And do you have the spoke?
The Iowa man has been blind for 25 years. The 4 family members sitting with him, cousins Jan Katzen and Ron Jackson, his 2 daughters, Shauna Williamson and Shannon Jackson, share the rare genetic disorder that took his sight.
How old were you when you started having real vision problems?
Probably 1970. I had to give up driving in 73. I noticed that it was just too dangerous to try to drive. I couldn't see far enough forward.
Jackson was in his 20s at the time. His mother was blind and so were other family members. But it wasn't until he was in his 40s that he was diagnosed with ADNIV, a disease which causes extreme inflammation of the retina. Doctors realized the genetic disorder had already passed through 3 generations of his extended family. There are about 100 cases reported in the United States. They account for 61.
My mother went blind, my brother went blind, my cousins have gone blind, and one of these days I know I will too.
Shannon and Shauna started having problems in their 30s. Both are now legally blind.
You just think it's the end of the world, but then, you know, like with my dad, he's still going full force, so I know we can too.
He's always telling me there's worse things in life than being blind. And I'm like, yes, you're right, there is.
Do you think your outlook has made it easier to deal with this disease?
Yeah, I just accept, you know, that I'm not going to probably see, and I'm just going to make the best of it. I don't even think of it anymore as being blind. I'm enjoying life as much as it can give me, you know.
Have a good day.
Jackson says the disease, which robbed him of sight, has helped him to see life a lot more clearly. Vanita Nair, CBS News, Burlington, Iowa.
And that's the CBS Evening News for tonight. For all of us at CBS News all around the world, good night.